All right, our next lecture here for Unit 3 on the physiology side will be about bone development. How do all these bony tissues in the body actually develop, and what do they start off as? So this process of bone development has a more formal name, and that is osteogenesis. Remember Genesis, like Genesis in the Bible, the beginning to create something. So osteogenesis literally refers to bone formation, and another term for that is ossification. So you should be familiar with both of those terms. Bone formation actually begins when you're an embryo, so in the second month of development in the uterus, in the womb, but it actually continues postnatally. Prenatal means before birth, postnatal means after birth. So of course your bones keep growing, as you know, all through childhood and through adolescence on into early adulthood. One of the things we'll talk about during this section of the course, or I may put an activity on Blackboard for you, will be about gender differences. And so females actually typically, on average, will stop growing a few years earlier than males, and that's one of the major reasons why, on average, females are shorter than males. And then another aspect of bone development is called bone remodeling and repair. So, if your bones get injured, they have to be repairs. And then bone remodeling actually can refer to this back and forth process that I've mentioned a little bit about earlier, where your bones are used to store calcium. And when you need to raise the levels of calcium in your body fluid, because calcium is extremely critical to the function of really all of your body systems, but especially the muscular and the nervous system. You have to harvest calcium out of the bones, and then it gets put back in, and then it gets harvested, and then it gets put back in. And so that is that can be called bone remodeling as well. All right, there are two types of ossification or osteogenesis that occur, two different pathways by which embryonic tissues get converted over to bone. The first one is called intramembranous. Intramembranous literally means within a membrane, and so what that means is the bones that ossify that way start off as sheets of fibrous connective tissue, thin, like a membrane, very thin sheets. This occurs in your flat bones, so your clavicles, and then your cranial bones, the cranial bones that are flat. Those are really the only bones that ossify through this pathway. The rest of the bones in the body ossify through what's called endochondral ossification. So endo, that prefix, means within. That's one of those prefixes you'll see a lot in your biology classes, so it's good to learn what that means. And then chondral, hopefully you're becoming familiar with C-H-O-N-D, that refers to cartilage. So this literally means within cartilage, and more specifically hyaline cartilage. What this means is most of the bones in your body start off as entirely hyaline cartilage. They're like little hyaline cartilage templates, and then they begin the process of ossification, during which they convert over into osseous tissue, bone tissue instead. So we'll take a look at these two different pathways by which your bones form. The first one, let's talk about intramembranous ossification. So let me write that up here. This is intramembranous. If my stylus will cooperate with me here. Intramembranous ossification. So again, this is going to occur in flat bones like you have in the cranium up in here, and then your clavicles. So those start off as little thin sheets of fibrous connective tissue, which in an embryo, so this is like when you're only 2 months along in development, that type of connective tissue can also be called a mesenchyme. That's an embryonic connective tissue. And because it's a connective tissue, so the purpley stuff you see here on the diagram, and you can see all the little fibers in there, your collagen fibers and so forth, that's a connective tissue. These cells on the diagram that are labeled as mesenchymal cells, those are kind of like the fibroblasts in this connective tissue. So those are the cells that are producing the fibers and the other substances you have there in that connective tissue. Well, what happens when this ossification process begins, some of these mesenchymal cells in those sheets of tissue change. They undergo changes and they become osteoblasts. So that's what you see here. You've got a little cluster of osteoblasts. And that'll happen, maybe close to the center of that sheet of connective tissue in the embryo. And this becomes what's known as an ossification center. So that's where ossification is going to begin in whichever flat bone this is going to be. So those osteoblasts, again, those are your bone synthesizing cells. So they start secreting all the little dots you see on there. That's supposed to be the osteoid. Remember, the osteoid, that's an organic, that's the early bone matrix that's still pretty soft in consistency. It's got glycoproteins and proteoglycans in it. And that attracts in calcium and phosphate. Those ions are attracted to that type of tissue, and once they build up in concentration, they form those hydroxyapatite crystals. And so that's when you convert this tissue over into osseous type tissue once you have that hard matrix present there. All right, that's what they're showing you here on step 2 of intramembranous ossification here. So those original osteoblasts that you had that started forming the ossification center, once that bony matrix forms around them, they convert into osteocytes like we've talked about before. And they're in their little lacunae in there, surrounded by a little bit of fluid. And their job now will be to maintain that matrix. When things need to be replaced and so forth, they'll secrete the replacements. And then you still have osteoblasts out here around the edges that keep laying down more osteoid that attracts more calcium and phosphate ions in to harden the matrix or calcify the bony matrix. And so that ossification center basically just gets wider and wider and wider and wider, and it spreads out. And you'll have these ossification centers that start in different flat bones. So which we talked about over on the anatomy side a little bit, like you'll have different ossification centers in the 2 parietal bones in the skull, the left and the right parietal bone, ossification center in the frontal bone. And so all this this ossification, it approaches the other centers, and eventually those newly forming bones are going to come into contact with each other, and they'll form the fontanelles in the fetal skull, the little soft spots, and where the bones kind of come together but don't quite fuse, you end up with those suture joints. And at the suture joints in the skull, when you learn about those over on the anatomy side, what's left between those, you have a little bit of this dense connective tissue that never ossifies, and that forms those suture joints between those bones. All right, let's see. And we'll move on to our next step here for intramembranous ossification. Now this picture is, the other pictures you're zoomed in, at a microscopic level, you're looking at individual cells. And in this picture you have zoomed out more. So they're just showing you that as more and more and more ossification takes place, you've got blood vessels that are growing into the developing bony tissue. Spongy bone, the bone takes on the spongy bone or the woven bone shape, where you have those trabeculae, those T-shaped structures. Woven bone is another name for this type of bone as well. For some reason, there's lots of different names for spongy bone. Then the spaces in between there, you'll have marrow that develops, softer tissues that are involved in blood cell formation. All right, let's move on to our next picture over here. Yeah, this is what I wanted to show you over here. So now you're zoomed out even a little bit further, and you're looking at this flat bone that's developing in a cross section on this particular diagram. All right, so you've got all that spongy bone formation that goes on in the center, and then out here at the edges you have a bunch of osteoblasts that synthesize compact bone. So that's why in these flat bones you end up with spongy bone in the center, and then you have the edges lined in compact bone. So in the skull, the superficial and the deep portions of those flat bones will consist of compact bone. So the portion of the bone that's closest to the brain will consist of compact bone. And again, diploe is another name for spongy bone that you have inside these types of bones, and you'll have red bone marrow that develops there as well. Also, you have the periosteum that develops the dense connective tissue covering around these bones, both on the outer surface and the inner surface of those types of bones. All right, so that's intramembranous type ossification. And I'm actually going to stop this video lecture here because on the next one we're going to talk about endochondral ossification, which is how most of the bones in your body develop. And that topic's a little bit longer because that's going to lead into what continues to occur after birth and things like your growth plates. Those are something that are very important to think about with child and adolescent development. So we'll cover all of that in the next video lecture on bone development.